The signal came in wrong. That was the first thing Commander Velashari noticed, not the content of the transmission, not the coordinates embedded within it, not even the identity of the sender. It was the texture of the signal itself, jagged, uneven, modulated through what her instruments classified as biological interference, which meant whoever had sent it had done so not from a ship, not from a station, but from something alive. Something warm, something that breathed. The second thing she noticed was that the Empress's personal frequency was woven through it like a thread of light buried inside a storm. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds before she contacted the Imperial fleet. By then, it was already too late to contain what was coming. The Veil had been searching for Princess Serenith Kale for 11 days. 11 days of escalating panic dressed in the formal language of Imperial protocol. 11 days of admirals delivering bad news with increasingly rigid posture. 11 days of the Empress sitting in the throne chamber with her hands folded precisely in her lap and her secondary hearts, the ones the Empire pretended she didn't have, beating at twice their normal rate. 11 days of the most sophisticated search apparatus in the known galaxy, finding nothing but empty space and a silence so complete it had started to feel intentional. The Veil did not lose things. This was not arrogance, it was architecture. Their civilization had been built across 43 star systems over the course of 600 years specifically to ensure that nothing valuable was ever truly lost. Every Veil of significant status carried 17 distinct identity markers embedded in their biology, broadcasting passively across multiple frequencies at all times. Princess Serenith Kale carried 23 ways to find her, 23 failsafes, 23 redundant systems, because she was the only child of the Empress, and the Empire ran on the principle that the heir to everything must always be findable. All 23 markers had gone dark simultaneously. Not damaged, not destroyed, not even scrambled, dark, as though something had reached into the physics of the situation and quietly turned off the lights. The Imperial Science Division had reviewed the data 40 times and reached the same conclusion each time: this should not be possible. The markers operated on different principles. Some were biological, triggered by cellular activity. Some were electromagnetic, embedded in the neural tissue. Some were quantum entangled, meaning their counterparts elsewhere in the galaxy should have registered a disturbance regardless of what happened to the princess. Quantum entanglement did not care about local interference. Quantum entanglement did not care about anything. It simply was, and yet, silence. 3 admirals had suggested very quietly that the princess might be dead. The Empress had listened to each of them with absolute stillness, and then removed them from their commands without a word. Not as punishment, as a statement of fact, the Empire did not proceed from the assumption of loss. It was Admiral Thesivane, the 4th Admiral, the one who had spent most of her career studying the outer systems, who said something different. She said it in a briefing room with 11 other officers present, which was how it became a problem. She said, "We should consider the human territories." Humans had been known to the Veil for approximately 30 years. Known in the way one knows about a persistent weather pattern or a geological fault, acknowledged, categorized, monitored from a respectful distance. They occupied a small cluster of systems at the galactic periphery, had developed faster-than-light travel independently, impressive if inelegant, and had proceeded to make themselves inconvenient in a variety of ways that didn't individually constitute a threat, but collectively produced a kind of low-grade institutional headache. They didn't follow protocols the way other species did. This was the charitable interpretation. The less charitable interpretation, held privately by a significant portion of the Imperial diplomatic corps, was that they didn't follow protocols at all, that they had somehow constructed an entire civilization on the principle that rules were suggestions and suffering was negotiable, and that they remained too small and too scattered to make this anyone else's problem just yet. The Veil had not yet needed to make them anyone else's problem. 30 years of uneasy, arm's-length commerce, a handful of diplomatic incidents, a border adjustment that the humans had agreed to with an equanimity the Veil found either reassuring or deeply suspicious depending on who you asked. The Empire's official position was that humanity was a developing species, technologically adolescent, emotionally volatile, ultimately harmless. Admiral Thesivane had never entirely agreed with the official position. She didn't say why she thought the human territories were relevant. She only said that the timing of the princess's disappearance correlated with a human trade vessel that had been in the same sector, that the vessel had subsequently altered course in a way that didn't match its filed navigation plan, and that when she had attempted to access the vessel's transponder records, she had found them technically present but somehow unreadable in a way that her instruments couldn't explain. Unreadable was a word that meant something specific to the Veil. It meant encrypted. It meant hidden. It meant that someone had looked at the Empire's ability to access information and had built something designed specifically to frustrate it. The room was very quiet. Someone asked whether the Veil had the capability to intercept the vessel. Thesivane said yes. Someone else asked whether they should. Thesivane said she didn't know and that her not knowing should be treated as significant. The vessel was called the Meridian Claws. It was a mid-range human cargo hauler, the kind of ship that wasn't impressive enough to be memorable and wasn't decrepit enough to attract concern, which, a later analysis would suggest, was probably not accidental. Its crew manifest listed 7 people. Its cargo manifest listed industrial components, biological specimens, standard xenobotany collection, properly licensed, and approximately 300 units of a preserved food substance that translated roughly as fermented grain paste. The Veil intercepted it 16 hours after the briefing. They sent 2 cruisers. This was, by Imperial doctrine, appropriate overwhelming force for a single civilian hauler, enough to communicate seriousness without being so aggressive that it constituted an act of war against human territory. The cruisers pulled alongside the Meridian Claws, matched velocity, and broadcast a standard Imperial boarding demand on all frequencies. The human vessel did not respond immediately. The 2 cruiser captains looked at each other across 17 million kilometers of space and experienced something their training had not precisely prepared them for: the specific anxiety of not knowing whether silence meant defiance, malfunction, or something else entirely. After 4 minutes and 20 seconds, a response came. It was audio only, a single human voice, male, unhurried. The translation came through as, "Sure, give us a minute." The Imperial officers were not certain what "give us a minute" meant in this context. The phrase suggested temporal negotiation, which was not a category their boarding protocols included. They waited. 6 minutes passed. The airlock opened. The human who met them at the airlock was approximately average by human standards, which meant he was taller than any Veil present, broader across the shoulders than the physiology charts had implied, and standing with a posture that the boarding team's sociologist would later describe as aggressively calm. He introduced himself as Captain Marcus Holt. He offered his hand in the human greeting gesture. The boarding team's lieutenant declined to take it, because she had been briefed that humans sometimes used physical contact as a dominance assessment and she was not going to be assessed. Captain Holt lowered his hand without apparent offense. He was chewing something, slowly, rhythmically. The team's medic flagged this behavior as potentially aggressive. The repetitive jaw motion in several species indicated preparation for confrontation. A warning was transmitted to the cruiser captains. The cruiser captains elevated their defensive posture. Holt offered the boarding team what he called coffee, which their instruments identified as a hot liquid containing a mild neurostimulant. They declined. He poured himself a cup and kept chewing. "You're looking for someone," he said. It wasn't a question. The lieutenant confirmed that they were conducting a search operation under Imperial authority and that the Meridian Clause was required to submit to a full inspection. "Sure," Holt said again. He stepped aside. He did this so simply, so immediately, that the boarding team spent several seconds not moving because they had been prepared for resistance and were not certain what to do with its complete absence. They had rehearsed 11 different escalation scenarios on the way over. None of them had begun with "sure." They began their inspection. It took 3 hours. They found the industrial components, the xenobotany specimens, and the fermented grain paste. They found crew quarters that smelled aggressively of a substance their instruments couldn't classify but which the medic's physiological response suggested was mildly unpleasant. They found a small room that appeared to be used for recreation, containing human games and what appeared to be an enormous pile of soft fabric that served no obvious structural purpose. They found an engineering bay that was meticulously organized in a way that felt instinctively wrong, not chaotic, not disordered, but arranged according to a logic that wasn't theirs, following priorities they couldn't quite reconstruct. They did not find Princess Serenith Kale. They did not find any evidence that a Veil had ever been aboard. They returned to the airlock. Captain Holt was still there, still drinking his coffee, still chewing. He asked if they'd found what they were looking for. The lieutenant said no. He said he was sorry to hear that. He said he hoped they found her. The lieutenant stopped. She had not told him they were looking for her. She turned. "How did you know?" "Common knowledge," Holt said. "In the outer sectors, the Empire's looking for someone, hasn't been quiet about it." He paused. "I assumed it was someone important." The lieutenant couldn't determine if this was true or not. She couldn't determine if anything about this interaction was true or not. She left the vessel. She filed her report. The report said, "Inspection completed, no findings, crew cooperative, vessel cleared." She added in the notes section, "I don't know what we missed." Serenith Kale had been afraid at first. This was important to understand, because she was a princess of the Veil Empire and fear was something she had been taught to manage rather than experience. And the first 12 hours aboard the Meridian Claws had involved a quality of fear she hadn't previously encountered, not the manageable fear of controlled situations, but something older and rawer. The fear of not knowing whether the person across from you wanted to help you or use you, and of being entirely unable to tell the difference. She had fallen into human space by accident. This was the truth, though it would later be disbelieved because the truth seemed insufficiently dramatic. She had been conducting an unauthorized survey, unauthorized because the Empress had explicitly forbidden it, which was in Serenith Kale's private estimation, the strongest possible reason to conduct it, of a region of space that Imperial charts listed as uninhabited, but that she had reason to believe contained something significant. Her navigation had been compromised by a gravitational anomaly. Her emergency beacon had activated, broadcasting on all available frequencies. The Meridian Claws had heard it first. Marcus Holt had pulled her out of a crippled shuttle with approximately 14 minutes of life support remaining. He had done this by suiting up himself, manually crossing the gap between vessels, cutting through a jammed hatch with a tool that looked like it had been constructed from spare parts and stubbornness, and carrying her back across open space on his back. He had not asked who she was first. He had not asked if she was valuable. He had not assessed the diplomatic implications or calculated the rescue's cost-benefit ratio or consulted a superior. He had simply looked at the situation, person, dying, fixable, and acted. This was the first thing that had confused her. She had filed it away and decided to address it later. The second thing was what he had done with her identity markers. She had explained carefully that she carried tracking systems that would bring the Empire directly to his ship. She had not explained why she didn't want that. She had been in the process of running away, technically, or at least conducting research she wasn't supposed to be conducting, and she wasn't certain yet what kind of trouble she was in or what kind she wanted to be in. She had only said, "There are tracking systems. If the Empire finds me right now, there will be consequences." Holt had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had called his engineer, a woman named Priya Sandoval who moved through the ship's mechanical systems the way a Vale scholar moved through a library, with the calm certainty of someone who had memorized every pathway, and they had spent 6 hours developing a solution. Serenith Kale had expected a technological solution. Some kind of jamming device, a signal blocker, the kind of thing a sufficiently sophisticated civilization might deploy against Imperial tracking. What Sandoval had built was not a jamming device. It was a field generator that produced a specific type of biological static, a mimicry of the electromagnetic noise generated by a living organism's cellular activity, tuned to precisely the frequency ranges her markers operated on, not jamming the signal, hiding it inside noise that looked like life. The markers were still active. They were simply buried inside a symphony of fake biology, so convincing that the Empire's instruments read it as interference from an organism rather than a deliberate block. The Empire's instruments weren't wrong technically. There was an organism creating interference. They just didn't realize the interference was the point. Serenith Kale had stared at the device for a long time. It was inelegant. It was improvised from components that had no business being combined. It worked, from what she could tell, through an approach that would have been considered crude by any Vale engineering standard. It had completely defeated 23 Imperial tracking systems in 6 hours. She had started paying very close attention to the humans. She had been given a bunk in the crew quarters. This had required negotiation not because the crew was unwilling, but because the crew was operating on an assumption she hadn't expected. They'd assumed she would want privacy. They'd rearranged their sleeping shifts to give her room to herself, not because she was royalty, they didn't know she was royalty yet, but because she was, as Holt had put it, obviously going through something. This was another thing she filed away. She had not told them she was a princess for 4 days. In that time she had been fed, clothed in borrowed human garments that didn't fit well but were warm, and included in the ship's common meals with a casualness that she found deeply disorienting. The crew of the Meridian Claws treated her with the same straightforward consideration they treated each other, not reverence, not suspicion, not the careful diplomatic distance she was accustomed to, but something that felt alarmingly like ordinary human regard. She mattered to them because she was present and had been in danger and was now here. That was apparently sufficient, she told Holt on the 5th day. She had been sitting in what the crew called the break room, the room with the fabric pile, which she had learned was called a blanket fort and had been constructed by the ship's medic, a young man named Tors, during a period of what the crew described as a very bad week. The fort had remained because, as Holt had explained, you didn't dismantle something that helped someone get through a very bad week. This explanation had occupied her for approximately 3 days. She told him her name. Her full name, the way Vale names were spoken, which contained embedded information about bloodline and status. She told him what it meant. Holt had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "Okay." She had waited for more. "That's going to complicate things," he'd added. She had asked if he was afraid. He'd thought about it, genuinely thought she could see him doing it, the way humans seem to actually process information rather than access pre-sorted responses, and said, "Not afraid exactly. More like, I want to make sure we get this right, for you, for me." You're the one who's going to have to live with however this ends. She had not known what to do with that sentence. She had spent the rest of the day thinking about it. The Empire had sent 17 ships to the outer sectors by the time the Meridian Claws reached the edge of human territory. 17 ships was a statement. It was the kind of deployment that meant, we are serious, we are frightened, and we are choosing to express both of these things as force because we don't know what else to do. Thessavane watched the deployment map and felt a cold certainty settling in her secondary stomach, the one she was also not supposed to have, a fact which made her feel a quiet kinship with the Empress that she never mentioned aloud. Something was wrong about the approach, not logistically, strategically. The 17 ships were approaching a problem that couldn't be solved by 17 ships, and the fact that they couldn't see this was exactly the kind of blindness that produced catastrophic results. She had spent 30 years studying the outer systems. She had spent a significant portion of that time studying humans specifically, which her colleagues considered a peculiar hobby, and she considered the most important work of her career. She had read everything the Empire had produced on the subject, and then she had done something her colleagues considered almost eccentric. She had read everything the humans had produced on themselves. It was not a small library. Humans documented everything. Their history, their failures, their embarrassments, their disasters, their recoveries from disasters. They kept records of things that served no strategic purpose, simply because they had happened. They recorded the personal experiences of individuals who had no political significance. They recorded conversations, emotions, the texture of ordinary moments. They built archives of loss. They studied their own fear. This was not what the Veil did. The Veil kept records of significance. History was the story of important events and important decisions made by important figures. The record existed to instruct, to provide precedent. Human history, Thessavane had come to understand, existed for a different reason. It existed so that humans would not forget what things had cost. She sat with this understanding for a long time before she understood why it mattered. And then slowly it came together. The 17 ships, the missing princess, the unreadable transponder, the captain who had said sure and stepped aside and somehow passed a 3-hour inspection, all of it connecting, forming a shape. She requested an urgent meeting with the Empress and said something that had never been said in the throne chamber before. She said, "The princess is safe, that's why we can't find her." The Empress did not move for a long time. Then she said, "Explain." Thessavane explained, not everything, she didn't have everything yet, but the shape of what she understood. The humans had the princess. The humans were hiding her, not out of malice, not as leverage. She was safe because the only reading of the captain's behavior that produced a consistent interpretation was that he was protecting someone who had needed protection, and that he would continue doing so until the situation was resolved in a way he found satisfactory. The Empress said, "What does he want?" Thessavane said she didn't think he wanted anything. The Empress said, "Everyone wants something." Thessavane said, "I know, that's what worries me." The message reached the Meridian Claws through a routing Thessavane had designed specifically not to look like an Imperial communication. Civilian band, human-adjacent encryption routed through 3 relay stations in outer human territory. It reached Captain Holt's personal frequency and it said in human language rather than Veil, "I know you have her, I know she's safe. I want to talk, not as a representative of the Empire, as someone who has been paying attention." Holt sat with the message for a long time. He brought it to Serenith Kale. She read it twice. Then she said something that surprised him. She said, "She's the one I was hoping would find us." "You were hoping to be found, eventually," she said, "by the right person." Holt looked at her. "That was the survey, the unauthorized one." "Yes, you weren't running away." "No, what were you looking for?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Evidence that the Empire's charts of this region are wrong. That the uninhabited space on our maps is actually inhabited by something we deliberately removed from our records." The ship was very quiet. "Removed," Holt said carefully. "Removed," she confirmed. "Approximately 200 years ago, before my mother's time, before anyone currently in the Empire had the clearance to know it happened. There are 14 star systems in this region of space that the Empire's official charts show as empty." She paused. "I've been corresponding, very carefully, with researchers who believe they might not be." Thessavane came aboard the Meridian Claws alone. This was her condition. No escort, no weapons, no recording devices beyond what Holt's own systems would capture. She arrived in a single shuttle and she sat across from Captain Holt in the ship's galley, and she accepted the cup of coffee he offered, because she had read enough to know that refusing it a second time would register as an insult she couldn't afford. It tasted, she noted privately, like something that had been burned and then dissolved in hot water. She drank it. Holt watched her do this with an expression she couldn't quite read. She had learned enough about human faces to know she was missing something, but not enough to know what. "You're not afraid of me," she said. "Should I be? I'm an admiral of the Empire that has 17 warships in this sector." "You also came alone," he said, "on purpose." She considered this. "The princess says you pulled her out of a dying shuttle without asking who she was." "Correct. Why?" He looked at her with what she was beginning to identify as the human expression for "Are you actually asking this?" he said, because she was dying. That's not a reason, it's the only reason that mattered. She sat with this. Your civilization is very strange, she said finally. Yours sent 17 ships because you lost one person, he said. I don't think we're the strange ones. She almost said that the ships were because of who the person was. Then she stopped, because Holt was still looking at her and she understood suddenly that this was his point. For him, for the people on the ships had nothing to do with who the person was. The ships were absurd. 17 ships for one person was absurd, except, she thought about it from the other direction. 17 ships for one person. Not 17 ships for the heir to an empire, but 17 ships because a single person had gone missing and the civilization that loved her could not rest. She thought about the human archives, the records of disasters, the records of loss. She thought about a species that documented grief as carefully as strategy. Where is she asked. Waiting for you to be ready, Holt said. She told me to make sure you drank the coffee first. Serenith, Kale and Thesivane spoke for 4 hours. Holt did not listen. He went to engineering and helped Sandoval with a maintenance issue that didn't strictly require his attention because he understood that what was happening in the galley was not his conversation to be part of. He stayed close enough to respond if needed and far enough away to be irrelevant. Sandoval asked him once if he was worried. He said, I'm worried about the 14 star systems. She stopped what she was doing. You believe her. She was doing unauthorized research in a restricted zone with her tracking disabled when her shuttle got hit by a gravitational anomaly, he said. If she was lying, she picked a very inconvenient way to do it. Sandoval was quiet for a moment. If the Empire removed a civilization from its records, then the Empire knows how to remove things from records. And she's the heir. Yes, who found evidence? Yes, Sandoval looked at the wall for a moment. We pulled her out of a dying shuttle, Marcus. I know, we've been hiding her from an Empire. I know, we might be the only people outside the Empire who know what she found. He said, I know, and then after a pause, we'd do it again. She thought about this. Yeah, she said, we would. When Thesivane came back from her 4 hours with the princess, she sat down across from Holt and looked at him for a long time without speaking. He poured her another cup of coffee and she drank it without apparent suffering this time, which he found interesting. She said, you understand what she found. The broad strokes, and you helped her anyway. She needed help. She needed help with something that could destabilize an empire. She needed help first, he said. The destabilizing was her business. Thesivane looked at him. Is that how humans decide things in sequence? Sometimes, he said. Sometimes we just decide and figure out the sequence later. She was quiet. Then the Empire is going to want answers about where she's been, about what happened to her tracking, about this vessel. I know, you should be afraid. I'm aware that's the logical response, he said, but he thought about it. But she's going to go back, and whatever she found out there, she's going to have to go back with it, and the Empire's going to have to look at it. And whatever happens because of that, he paused. That's worth something, even if we get caught in the middle of it. It might cost you. Most things do. She stared at him. You knew that from the beginning. From about hour 2, he said, once we figured out who she was, and you kept hiding her. We kept her safe, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Hiding her was the method, safe was the point. Thesivane looked at her coffee. She looked at it for a long time. In the Empire, she said, we protect important people because they are important, because the structure requires it. I know, you protected her because she was a person, he said, because she'd been through something terrible and she was scared and she needed someone to be on her side for a minute. That's it. She was quiet again for a long time. Then the 17 ships are going to demand an accounting. I figured, the diplomatic consequences could be significant. I know. The Empire will want to know who else knows about her research. I know. This crew is going to be fine, he said, with a certainty she couldn't locate the foundation of. It wasn't the certainty of someone who knew the outcome. It was the certainty of someone who had decided the outcome didn't change the calculation. She found this more unsettling than anything else she'd encountered. The princess returned to the Empire's custody 22 hours later. She went willingly, which surprised the admirals of the 17 ships who had been preparing for an extraction and found themselves instead conducting a formal reception for someone who arrived with her documentation organized, her findings catalogued, and a demand that her mother review the archives of 200 years ago presented with a precision that suggested she had been preparing it for longer than 11 days. The admirals filed their reports. The reports said, the princess had been sheltered by a human crew. The human crew had rendered her anonymous and hidden aboard their vessel using improvised technology. The tracking systems had been defeated through a method the science division categorized after review as functionally primitive but practically perfect. The reports did not know what to do with this. The science division noted in a footnote that the method used to defeat the tracking systems had not been something they had previously modeled as a threat vector. It was not sophisticated enough to have appeared on their vulnerability assessments. It was too simple. It operated on a principle so basic, hide the signal inside organic noise, that no one had thought to guard against it because no one had thought anyone would think of it. Someone had thought of it, in 6 hours, from spare parts. The footnote was flagged by 17 separate analysts and sent up the chain and ultimately arrived at Thesavane's desk, where she read it and sat back in her chair and felt the specific cold clarity of understanding something she hadn't been able to articulate before. The tracking systems had been designed against sophisticated threats, against technology that would try to match them or exceed them or directly counter them. Against adversaries who would approach the problem the way the Veil approached problems, through complexity, through refinement, through engineering of escalating elegance. The humans hadn't done that. The humans had looked at the problem and found the simplest possible version of a solution and executed it perfectly, not because they lacked sophistication, because they had looked at a sophisticated problem and asked, what's the actual thing we need to happen here? And the actual thing was simple. So they did the simple thing. Thesavane thought about this for a very long time. She thought about the boarding team that had spent 3 hours on the Meridian Claws and found nothing. She thought about the fact that there had been nothing to find, technically no hidden chambers, no evidence of the princess's presence, no detectable Veil biology anywhere on the ship. Then she thought about the fact that Serenith Kale had been on the ship the entire time. She had been in the blanket fort. The fabric pile in the recreation room, the enormous pile of soft material that served no obvious structural purpose. Tors had built it during a very bad week, and it had remained because you didn't dismantle something that helped someone through a very bad week. Serenith Kale had been inside it. Wrapped in layers of soft human fabric that absorbed heat signatures, muffled sound, and apparently provided sufficient biological interference to muddle the ship's own organic noise field into something that read as undifferentiated crew activity. The boarding team's instruments had registered crew quarters occupied. They had not registered Alien Royal concealed. Thesavane stared at the report. The most sophisticated tracking systems in the known galaxy had been defeated by a pile of blankets and a 6-hour engineering session. She thought about what that meant, not as a tactical assessment. As a philosophical one, she thought about a civilization that built its solutions from what it had, from what was available, from what was here right now, because right now was what mattered. She thought about the captain who had suited up and crossed open space to pull someone out of a dying shuttle without asking who she was. She thought about the engineer who had built a signal masking field from cargo components in 6 hours. She thought about the medic who had built a blanket fort during a very bad week and left it up because it had helped. She thought about 14 star systems that the Empire's charts listed as empty. She thought about the princess who had gone looking for them alone, with her tracking disabled, because the truth was more important than the safety of conducting research with permission. She thought about a very young woman wrapped in someone else's blankets in a ship she'd never been on before, not knowing what was going to happen, surrounded by humans who had decided, without being asked, without any formal obligation, without any calculation of benefit, that she was their responsibility now. She pulled out a fresh document. She wrote at the top, Threat Reassessment, Human Civilization. Then she sat back and thought about what to actually write, because everything she had believed about threat assessment 3 weeks ago had assumed threats would present themselves as threats, had assumed that danger looked like danger, that power announced itself, that any civilization capable of defeating the Empire's systems would do so with a sophistication the Empire could recognize and respond to. The humans hadn't presented themselves as anything, they had simply acted without announcement, without strategy, at least not in any form the Empire would recognize as strategy. The captain had acted because a person needed help. The engineer had solved because a problem needed solving. The medic had built a fort because a week had been very bad and something warm had helped. And the cumulative result of all this acting and solving and building, this ordinary relentless doing of the thing in front of them, had been the heir to the Empire safe, the Empire's tracking systems defeated, a boarding inspection passed perfectly, 17 ships positioned to respond to a crisis that had already been resolved in a cargo hauler's recreation room. She wrote, finally, we have been assessing human civilization against the wrong scale. We have been asking whether they can match our capability. We should have been asking whether they operate by our logic at all. She paused. They do not. She paused again. This is not a weakness. Marcus Holt received a formal diplomatic communication from the Veil Empire 14 days after the princess returned. It was on official imperial frequency, bearing the Empress's personal seal. The crew gathered in the galley to watch him open it. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was an acknowledgement of service rendered, phrased in the formal register of imperial diplomatic language, which meant that it was approximately 800 words long and said essentially, thank you, and we are watching you, and we do not entirely know what to do with you. There was a second document attached, lower priority, marked as supplemental correspondence. It bore a different seal, personal rather than imperial, from an individual rather than an institution. It was from Serenith Kale. Said, I told my mother about the blanket fort. She wanted me to ask if Tors would make one for me. She thinks I could use it. I agree. S. Holt looked at the message for a long time. Tors looked over his shoulder and said, does that mean what I think it means? I think it means we might be invited to the palace, Holt said. For what? To build a blanket fort for a princess. The galley was very quiet. Then Sandoval said, should we be worried about what that means for the fabric trade? And Holt laughed, actually laughed, the way he hadn't in weeks, and the crew laughed with him, and somewhere at the edge of the galley tours was already thinking about structural reinforcement techniques, because if you were going to build a fort for an empress's ere you were going to do it properly. Thesavane's report went into the Imperial Archives. It was classified at the highest level, accessible to 12 individuals in the entire empire, and it said many things in careful bureaucratic language that added up to a single conclusion. She never stated explicitly because she knew that explicit statements could be argued with while evidence could not. The evidence was this: a human crew with improvised technology, ordinary courage, and no strategic interest in the outcome had done what 17 Imperial warships could not. They had kept the air safe. They had kept her hidden. They had looked at the most sophisticated tracking apparatus in the known galaxy and found, in 6 hours, a solution so simple it was invisible. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter in the way the Empire measured intelligence, but because they had looked at the person in front of them and decided that person mattered, and that mattering created an obligation, and an obligation required action regardless of cost, regardless of consequence, regardless of whether it made sense by any calculus the Empire used. They had not calculated whether it was worth it. They had not assessed their own risk. They had simply done it because not doing it had never seriously been considered. Thesavane thought about what this meant for a species. About a civilization built on the principle that the person in front of you was reason enough, that the thing needing doing was reason enough, that the moment you were in was the one that mattered, not the one after, not the long term, not the strategic landscape, the one right now with this person who needed help. She thought about how far that principle could take a species that was still, by every metric in the early stages of its development, still small, still scattered. Still operating at the technological adolescent stage, the Empire had categorized them as when they first arrived. Still capable of defeating 23 Imperial tracking systems with a blanket fort, she thought about what they would be capable of when they were older. She thought about the 14 star systems. She thought about a princess who had gone looking for the truth alone without permission, because the truth was more important than safety. She thought about the captain who had pulled a stranger from a dying ship without asking who she was. She wrote at the end of her report a single final line, not analysis, not recommendation, just the thing she had been trying not to say for the entire document because saying it changed something irrevocably and she was not certain the Empire was ready to have it changed. She wrote, "They are not like us, they are not even like anything we have encountered before. Every civilization we have studied acts in accordance with interest, survival, or principle. Humans act in accordance with something that precedes all three, something that does not have a name in our language because we have never needed a word for it. The closest approximation is, they act in accordance with what they cannot bear not to do, and the list of things they cannot bear not to do is longer than we understand, and it does not shorten when circumstances become difficult. It appears, in fact, to grow." She read it back, she left it. She submitted the report and went to her window and looked out at the star field and thought about a ship full of humans somewhere out there in the outer systems, carrying cargo and specimens and fermented grain paste, going about the ordinary business of existing in a galaxy they had barely begun to explore. Building forts, drinking burned water. Chewing through meetings with calm that looked like insolence, until you understood it was something else entirely. Being unimpressed by power and unafraid of consequence and constitutionally, fundamentally, stubbornly oriented toward the person in front of them regardless of what the person in front of them was worth by any external measure. A princess of the Vale Empire was safe tonight because a man in a second-hand spacesuit had decided without deliberation that she needed to be. The Empire would spend years trying to understand the calculation behind that decision. They would not find one. That was the part that would keep Thesavane awake for the rest of her life. Not that the humans had defeated their systems, not that they had hidden a royal heir from 17 warships, not even that they had done it with fabric and spare parts and 6 hours of stubborn engineering. It was that when she had finally asked Holt what he had been thinking, in the moment when he suited up to cross open space to a dying ship without knowing who was inside it, he had looked at her with genuine confusion, as though the question didn't parse, as though the idea that there had been a thinking to be done was itself the strange part. He had said, someone needed help, and then he had shrugged and gone back to his coffee.